Good afternoon. My name is Beth Simmons, and I'm the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And I'm delighted to welcome each and every one of you to the 6th Warren and Anita Manshel Lecture in American Foreign Policy. It's fitting and indeed a great privilege for us to open the celebration for our center's 50th anniversary with this lecture. To shed light on American foreign policy and America's role in a rapidly changing world was one of the founding purposes of our center and remains a core concern of the Research Center today. It's my particular pleasure to extend a welcome to Leanne and Michael and to David Manshel and their families and friends who are here today. Thank you very much. Just a few words about the lecture series itself. Warren and Anita Manshel, to whom this series is dedicated, were extraordinary people. Amongst his many achievements, Warren, who immigrated from Germany to escape the rise of Nazism, was a leader of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and played an important role in countering the susceptibility of European intellectual and political figures from the blandishments of communism. Anita supported Warren in his many endeavors, which included a 3-year tour as the ambassador to Denmark, while she also pursued a parallel career in the promotion of art and music. Given Warren's active support for what was then known as the Center for International Affairs, and both of their longstanding interests in international relations and in public affairs, this lectureship was created to honor their memory, and it continues to benefit from the generosity of the Manshel family. Past Manshel lecturers have offered a wide variety of views on the state of the world and on U.S. foreign policy in particular. They've been both provocative and evocative. And today's speaker is a most welcome beacon among these leading lights. Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu's many achievements are far too numerous to mention here, so I'll just name a few of them. The 1984 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, he was elevated to the position of Archbishop of Cape Town in 1986 and played a central role in the transition to democracy in South Africa. Appointed chairman of the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission by President Mandela, he presided over a body tasked with uncovering the human rights violations that had occurred under apartheid. Though he retired in 1996, Archbishop Tutu has remained a moral force in international affairs, helping to raise awareness for the campaign against HIV/AIDS, and most recently, bringing attention to the humanitarian crisis in Darfur. Archbishop Tutu has been influencing the course of history nearly his entire life. The year that our center was founded, 50 years ago, he resigned as a 27-year-old school teacher from his post at the Johannesburg Bantu High School in protest over the passage of the Bantu Education Act, which extended apartheid and institutionalized instructional inequality throughout South Africa's educational system. Our center's scholars began to recognize the importance of transnationalism and the influence of transnational non-governmental actors in international relations and national politics in the 1970s, and Archbishop Tutu would have made an interesting case study, moving between London and his home in South Africa, not only studying, but enlightening a world about the realities suffered by his people. Today, we're challenged as scholars to know the world as it is experienced and as it is lived by its inhabitants. As social scientists, we're increasingly advantaged by instant access to digitized data. We search for parsimonious theory in a world of messy reality, and we celebrate our scholarly objectivity. But I think it's also good and necessary, I believe, that we imbibe the wisdom of an intellect, an activist, and a man of faith. I respect the controversy he has provoked throughout his life, and I'm not surprised that his capacity to provoke continues. From a man who knows the value and the limits of patience, and appropriately, with the tempest as our backdrop, today we'll find out just how and why goodness triumphs ultimately. So please welcome Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu.
Madam Chairperson, the Manshel family, the first director of the Weatherhead Center, Dr. Bowie, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words of welcome and introduction. And thank you to the splendid choir. It is a very, very great privilege and honor a few years ago, my wife and I went to a small village in the Netherlands. They they decided to name the school, the village school, after me, which is not the important part of the story. When we arrived, the school was celebrating its 400th anniversary. And when we arrived in the village, a little girl came up to me and said, "Were you here when the school started?" I thought I was decrepit, but I didn't think it was quite so obvious. It is a very great honor to have been asked to deliver this particular Warren and Anita Manshel lecture at such an auspicious time when this distinguished center, the Featherhead Center for International Affairs, celebrates its golden anniversary. Heartiest congratulations on such a signal achievement, and may the center and its members go from strength to strength as they continue to make significant interventions in the conduct of public affairs, and particularly relating to US foreign policy. Secondly, I must confess that I really should not have accepted such a prestigious invitation. I succumbed to the blandishments of a seductive member of the center, Donna Hicks. I don't belong here. The executive director, Stephen Bloomfield, very kindly sent me a comprehensive brief about the history of the center and told me about the style and ethos of the center, working as it did in a collaborative, interdisciplinary, intergenerational way with undergraduates, graduates, academics, scholars, and practitioners interacting. It was all very impressive, and he supplied me with a list of the kind of people who have performed here. I note in the long list of those who have contributed to the work of the center, there was a particular category that was missing. I'm not sure whether it was an oversight, but it was quite significant. There was no mention of the class, so far as I could make out, philosophers, ethicists, moralists, or theologians. That is why I asserted that I really do not belong here. As it is, I'm neither scholar nor practitioner. After all, I'm now emeritus, signifying that I've been put out to pasture. Enough of that. But I have to tell you this delicious story. We were getting honorary degrees from Yale, and our representative was the president of Stanford University, who told the story of an honorary degree recipient who went on about how utterly unworthy he was of that honor when Prime Minister Golda Meir piped up, "Oh, so-and-so, get on with it. You are not so great that you can be so humble." So do not expect a scholarly disquisition by the ramblings of a supernumerary prelate. I speak to you not as an expert on foreign affairs. I speak to you as a religious leader who will use the categories appropriate to my discipline, deity, goodness, etc., and will consider whether a particular course of action was good or bad, right or wrong, and not whether in some utilitarian way it might have been successful or not, expedient or otherwise. Hence the title of my address. I was recently asked to contribute to the journal Foreign Policy. The brief given to some 20 or so of us was to suggest one unilateral magnanimous gesture or action that the incoming US president might make to counteract the alleged anti-Americanism abroad. I entered a caveat immediately in my contribution. I said that I was not aware of any anti-Americanism about. What I certainly could attest to was a substantial resentment and indeed hostile opposition to the policies of a particular US administration, and contended, as I do now, that the two are quite distinct and separate. As an elucidating example, I pointed out that in the years of the anti-apartheid struggle, the Reagan White House was firmly opposed to the application of sanctions against the South African apartheid regime, preferring what it described as constructive engagement. Many of us were incensed by this policy and opposed it with every fiber of our being. I recall that I probably dismayed many people when on one occasion I was told of the latest Reagan rejection of our call for US sanctions against Pretoria. I retorted out of deep exasperation, "The West can go to hell." I was then Bishop of Johannesburg, and some thought it was decidedly unepiscopal language. I was very angry against the Reagan administration, but that did not make me anti-American. As it happened, we appealed over the head of the White House incumbent to the American people, and especially to the magnificent college and university students. Their campaigns and demonstrations eventually effected a change in the moral climate in this country, so that Congress went on to pass the anti-apartheid legislation with a presidential veto override to boot, which was quite an accomplishment given the huge popularity of President Reagan. The point I am laboring to establish is that anger and resentment at the policies of a particular administration do not necessarily translate into anti-American sentiment. We must draw that distinction and perhaps help to dispel a paranoia that causes people to have a siege mentality and permits them then to be manipulated out of a fear by those who claim to be protecting them from the big bad wolf out there, straining to get at them, paying for their blood, so that they are ready and willing to subvert and indeed jettison what many of us perhaps naively had believed to be entrenched American values, which so many of us admired greatly and which had inspired us to strive after similar standards in our own countries. I never imagined in my worst dreams that I would live to see the day when the US would abrogate the rule of law and of habeas corpus, as has happened in the case of those described as enemy combatants incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay, and that I would hear an American government and its apologists use exactly the same justification for detention without trial as had been used by the apartheid government of South Africa, a practice that the US at the time condemned roundly, as was so utterly right to have done. And all of this I've been surprised at this, little of the outrage from the American public one had expected. So for us, it was a devastating case of deja vu, so thoroughly disillusioning. When I was perhaps 9 or so, I picked up a tattered copy of Ebony magazine. I still don't know where it could have come from in my ghetto township with its poverty and squalor. It described how a Jackie Robinson, a black man like us, had broken into Major League Baseball and was playing scintillatingly for the Brooklyn Dodgers. I did not know baseball from ping pong, but that was totally irrelevant. What mattered was that a black man had made it against huge odds, and I grew inches and was sold on America from then on. With many of my fellow black kids, victims of a system that sought to instill in us a huge sense of inferiority and self-hate, we found an antidote in the exploits of black American sports heroes such as Jesse Owens, who upstaged Hitler, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, and how devastated we were when he lost to Max Schmeling. Heroes such as Sugar Ray Robinson, well, that tells you my vintage. I can't tell you how our hearts swelled with pride to see the movie Stormy Weather, with an all-black cast, with the likes of Lena Horne, Fats Waller, Cap Galloway, whose sartorial style was slavishly imitated by our township dandies. Your history inspired us. We learned Lincoln's Gettysburg Address by heart. And when the apartheid government introduced Bantu education, designed to turn us into docile, kowtowing, perpetual serfs, it expunged the American War of Independence from our history curriculum because it was regarded as likely to plant subversive ideas in our impressionable and basically simple minds. The civil rights movement inspired us profoundly, and we thrilled at the soaring oratory of a Martin Luther King Jr., and how we were filled with a vicarious pride, captivated by his I Have a Dream spellbinder. We too sang We Shall Overcome in our anti-apartheid rallies. Leah and I named our firstborn child Trevor Armstrong for Louis Seshmo Armstrong. No, there has not been a knee-jerk anti-Americanism abroad. If anything, it is the opposite that has been very much in evidence. There might be pockets of anti-Americanism, but as a universal global phenomenon, no. How could people easily forget your incredible generosity expressed in the Marshall Plan that helped Europe get back on its feet? And was it not demonstrated so spectacularly with that extraordinary outpouring of sympathy and concern after 9/11? That surely could not have happened, certainly not on such a vast global scale. People genuinely cared, everywhere virtually. And so what happened that all these positive, warm feelings towards the US were disrupted and turned into the negative ones of hostility and anger? The US quite soon began to flex its solitary superpower muscles in a unipolar world. People were talking about our responsibility for the environment, about global warming, and so on. And most of the world showed its seriousness and commitment by signing the Kyoto Accord. The US snubbed the world, basically seeming to say, go jump in the lake, in a unilateralism that would be a defining characteristic of US foreign policy from then on. President Clinton signed the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. The second, President Bush, reversed that decision and would not ratify the establishment of the court because he asserted that it would hamper American security arrangements if US citizens could be charged frivolously and indicted before the court. Why US citizens should be particularly vulnerable was not clear to most non-Americans, and it was to misstate the nature and jurisdiction of this court, which has quite stringent rules about its jurisdiction. Very few in the world, in the rest of the world, were fooled. It was yet another unilateral act by which the world's only superpower would seemingly disdainfully thumb its nose at the rest of the world. Resentment was beginning to build up, but not as anti-American apart from exceptional instances. It was resentment at the policies of a particular US administration. This was before 9/11, but it had been building up. It was a resentment and frustration and impotence which did not prevent the outpouring of love, sympathy, and support after 9/11. And when the US did not retaliate immediately, as many of us had expected, kind of tit for tat, even if the real culprits were unknown, just hitting out at somebody to show the US was not to be trifled with. When this did not happen immediately, we believed, hey, a new era is dawning. Hey, perhaps we are witnessing the birth of a new paradigm in international affairs. As a matter of fact, this act of unbridled terror, to be condemned unequivocally, would have provided just the sort of case the International Criminal Court had been established to deal with. Because the terrorists had not committed an act of war. What they had committed was an egregious crime. They were not representatives or combatants of a particular country. They should have been treated as what they were, criminals who had to be apprehended and indicted before a tribunal such as the International Criminal Court, and the whole world, or very nearly the whole world, would have collaborated with its efforts to bring these criminals responsible for such a dastardly deed to book, and would have done so enthusiastically because it was to uphold international rule of law. But that was a route the US could not have taken, having rejected the ICC. Your president was almost untouchable after 9/11. He could do no wrong. His popularity ratings were going through the roof. He was beyond criticism. I've headed this section I'm speaking on just now, Nostalgia for the Cold War. We had fondly imagined that the end of the Cold War would usher in a period of peace, prosperity, and stability. The world would see a reduction in defense spending, which would be diverted to more beneficial areas: education, health, housing, poverty eradication, etc. We did not realize that there came to be a huge disorientation. You see, the Cold War had provided us with what enabled us to find our bearings, to define our identities. We were pro-communism or anti-communism. Well, when communism went, who were we? The Cold War was a fertile arena for simplistic worldviews. And so President Reagan found resonance in many when he spoke of the evil empire. The world was conveniently divided into them and us. They, of course, were the baddies, and we were the goodies. It justified very morally questionable policies. The US supported Marcos in the Philippines, the Contras in Nicaragua, Savimbi in Angola, and elsewhere had surrogates whose human rights records were abominable, but who were the blue-eyed boys of the US because they proclaimed themselves anti-communist. Many of their countries paid heavily for this. Angola is still striving to recover from the devastation of the civil war against Dr. Savimbi. The US, we are told, was not averse from subverting the governments of countries who were not subservient to the US interests, including, as some have alleged, assassinations of unfriendly presidents, That was the fate, it seems, of President Allende of Chile, who was supplanted by the military dictator Pinochet, who played havoc with his people, but seemed a favorite of the US. And so US protestations about spreading democracy sound hollow when people remember recent history. And so 9/11 came to fill a vacuum. It provided the enemy, so indispensable seemingly to national identity. President Bush learned from President Reagan, quickly defining the world as those for or against the US, and even more disturbingly, identified certain countries as forming an axis of evil. They were all, by definition, the baddies, and we, the US and the allies, the goodies. So you have to find an enemy not so amorphous as those terrorists. So, okay, Al-Qaeda. It was not a criminal act that had been committed, they said, but an act of war. But who was the enemy? Okay, Al-Qaeda. And so you fasten on to him. A war against terror, yes, but you see, according to the rules of war, there has to be a country, a nation. And so Iraq was identified. It was conveniently forgotten that Saddam Hussein was spawned and equipped and supported at one time by the US. There had to be a regime change. Again, a unilateral determination. Why in Iraq and not in Saudi Arabia and not in China or wherever else? And there was no credible evidence that Saddam Hussein had provided bases for Al-Qaeda. But it had already been decided that he must go, and decided by the world's only superpower. Saddam was not many people's favorite, but you do not just invade a country because altruistically you want its government to change. Weapons of mass destruction provided a possible excuse. But the UN inspectors had as yet failed to produce credible evidence, and were asking for more time to find that evidence if it existed. But the US was impatient. If the rest of the world was playing games, the US wasn't. It sought the approval of the UN Security Council as the only legitimate authority for declaring war of the kind the US wanted, to punish Saddam for producing weapons of mass destruction. That approval was not forthcoming, and the US decided to go it alone. Many tried to say, give the inspectors more time. If they find the evidence, then it will be very difficult for anyone to oppose an invasion. Some of us invoke the time-honored Christian doctrine of the just war with its stringent conditions for determining whether a war is justifiable or not. For example, have you exhausted all non-violent options for resolving your particular crisis? In this case, no. What are the chances of success for the US in a disastrous miscalculation? Oh, very good. Then the war had to be declared by the proper, legitimate authority. And by going to the Security Council, the US considered it was not that authority. Another condition in the list of the just war conditions, you have to try to answer the question, will the situation after the war be better than before? No one in their right mind could say other than that it has been disastrous. The Pope sent a special envoy to the White House to counsel against going to war. I said that if it happened without the sanction of the Security Council, it would be immoral. Even if it had been afterwards a successful war and things had been better than the chaos of present-day Iraq, it would have been immoral ab initio. But the emergence of an enemy galvanized US patriotism. Flags were everywhere in evidence. The apartheid government had used similar tactics, criticizing the government. The South African government showed that you were really unpatriotic. They did not evaluate the cogency of your argument. They simply ruled you out of court by impugning your patriotism if you were a white South African. So there was yet another instance of déjà vu as we observe the goings-on in the US. I don't think anyone would disagree that the unilateral invasion of Iraq, with the connivance of some allies, nearly all of whom have paid with heavy election defeats for their part in this misadventure, that has been a serious miscalculation and a disaster in its consequences. It has dented the image of the US very widely, showing, as it seems, a superpower intent on throwing its weight around like a reckless bully. It has affected your discourse. Too many have acquiesced meekly in an abrogation of the rule of law. Language in a kind of Alice in Wonderland excursion has been made to mean what the powerful have wanted it to mean. You are fighting a war? Yes. So those fighting against you are soldiers? No. They are enemy combatants, a new category, so that the Geneva Convention should not apply. So you can have Guantanamo Bay. You can produce the conditions that made the violations at Abu Ghraib possible. That is not the best side of America on display. If someone had appeared before the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, accused of using the water torture that featured so prominently in the confirmation process for a new Attorney General, that method would have been condemned roundly as a gross violation of human rights and an example of some of the worst kind of torture. Sitting there and watching, I really could not believe what I saw and heard in this confirmation process. All of us want to see a just solution to the Middle East crisis. We wish all God's blessings for the Annapolis meeting. But we want to say what is so seemingly so obvious, certainly what we learned from our particular situation in South Africa. Peace will not come from the barrel of a gun, but when the fundamental rights of all are recognized, respected, and upheld. The West is quite rightly feeling quite guilty about its role in the Nazi Holocaust, and has been only too glad that others are having to pay the penance for that tremendous blot on humanity's copybook. A German diplomat recently said to me that, you know, Germany was doubly guilty. It was guilty because of the Holocaust, and it is guilty now for the unacceptable suffering of the Palestinian people. I recently, here in Boston, appealed to my spiritual kin, the Jews, to be true to their calling, obedient to their God, our God, the God of justice, the God of the poor and the downtrodden. I would hope that the US would be that too. Now, for a number of people, it would be to ask a question: was it just an act of cynicism or yet another example of US unilateralism to support the appointment of a Tony Blair as a special Middle East envoy? I cannot pretend I understand the logic relating to which countries may or may not be nuclear powers. Why Pakistan and not Iran, I don't know. I am just asking as someone utterly naive in these complex matters. Does being friendly with the world's superpower have anything to do with it? Much of the same criticisms can be leveled at the doctrines of the preemptive strike and regime change. Who, apart from the US, applies them? And are the determinations based on information supplied by the same intelligence services that failed so spectacularly in the case of Iraq? I'm so glad that I can turn to one or two aspects, because I speak, as I try to indicate to you, I speak as one who has not just an admiration, but a deep love for this country. So I'm glad that I can allude to at least two aspects of US foreign policy which I can applaud enthusiastically as the kind of things we all desperately hope would be what characterize that policy. I have nothing but the highest praise for US policy towards Burma, Myanmar. When I met with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, I told her, on this issue, the US is on the side of the angels. You really cannot be faulted. Your president has met with dissidents from that country, and at nearly every opportunity has spoken out clearly and unambiguously against the military junta and for freedom and democracy. And the First Lady has been quite outstanding on this issue as well. I take off my hat to them. That is the US we have hoped your country was and would be. And the US has been incredibly generous in its contributions to the Global Fund to combat tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV and AIDS, though it has been vitiated to some extent by ideological considerations with regard to condom use and birth control measures. But overall, I have admired US generosity as through PEPFAR. By the way, you might have wanted to know what I thought would be the one unilateral, magnanimous act your incoming president would make. I suggested that your new president would be surprised at the reaction of the world if he or she were to say to the world, we made a big mistake over Iraq. Sorry. And whilst that it shut down Guantanamo Bay and ratify the Rome Statute, I finish. This is a great country. You are some of the most generous people I have ever met. And I say that not to batter you. As I indicated, you were tremendous in your support of our anti-apartheid struggle. And we are free today able to say we are seeking to be democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, because of your contribution. Without you, our victory would have been, if not impossible, a great deal more difficult to have accomplished. And for that, one wants to say thank you. It is part of this incredible generosity that is a national characteristic. This, which we inhabit, is a moral universe. Right and wrong actually do matter. There is no way that injustice and oppression, evil can ever finally prevail. All the evidence of history validates this verdict. Ultimately, truth, justice, goodness, compassion will triumph over their ghastly counterparts. There is a choice being put before yourselves, before the US. To work assiduously with other nations for that justice, equity, and peace, or to follow the unilateral path leading to isolation and resentment. I quote words that Moses spoke on behalf of God to the Israelites. He said, "Today, I offer you the choice of life and good, of death and evil. I summon heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I offer you the choice of life or death, blessing or curse. Choose life, and you and your descendants will live." It is the same choice before the people of this great country. Thank you. I think you said that was part of the deal.
Yes, I was just wanted to confirm. So we have the opportunity now to open it up to the audience to ask questions, and I think we're equipped here also to just allow you to sit to answer with the microphone there. So we have microphones positioned here at the bottom of each stairway, and if there are questions, please just make your way to the microphone on each side. And what we will do is alternate between microphones. And let me also ask you, just in the interest of involving as many people as we can involve, to keep the questions, and if it's a comment, especially keep it as short as you can, so that we can hear Archbishop Tutu's response and then have as much participation as we can get. Let's start here.
Hi, thanks so much for coming here. I just had a quick question. I was wondering if you could comment at all about the situation in Zimbabwe and what you think both the American governments can do as well as the American people, and specifically if you could comment about how, given kind of the situation the U.S. has been in the past of supporting alternative governments that haven't worked as well, do you have any specific feedback about just the government and the American people? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a very, very good question and very distressing. I mean, the situation in Zimbabwe is one that is totally unacceptable, and many of us have tried to say this, and it's a bad dream, because President Mugabe used to be our showpiece guy. I mean, we held him up as an incredible example of what can happen. Because as you know, after his very first victory, you would have thought that they were going to have retribution and revenge, and he said quite firmly, no, we're going to work for reconstruction and reconciliation. And Ian Smith remained a member of parliament for donkey's years. I can't explain what happened there. I have said on occasion that we African leaders ought to hang our heads in shame for appearing to condone a horrendous situation. The AU, African Union, and SADC have taken certain initiatives, and recently our president has been involved in negotiations. But oh dear. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right that people get upset in Africa and in that particular situation when people elsewhere pontificate about what ought to be happening there. I don't know. I have mooted something that for purists is almost unacceptable. I've said that we really ought to look at the possibility of a soft landing for President Mugabe. And I know, I mean, that there would be the outrage and the horror of people who are saying, but aren't you encouraging impunity? And you say, you know, in situations such as that, you don't have a clear competition between good and bad. It is a choice between two evils. The evil of continuing what is happening and the evil of, appearing to encourage impunity. And most of you will know that, public affairs, I mean, we will sit up and assert very vociferously that this is what you must do. But don't they say, in a sense, that politics is the art of the possible? And what do? Do you say, to satisfy your purity, no, the people must continue to suffer? Or you say, we're going to grit our teeth and say, if you go quietly, we protect me.
It's a real honor to have you here. I just want to thank you again. And I'm a second-year divinity student studying to be a minister, studying to be a religious leader, and we've been so inspired by you. And my question is one that I want to take back to my congregation where I'm doing an internship right now, what advice would you give me to tell them about how we can help our administration choose life, not only in the town, the little New England town that I'm working in, but at a regional and a national, international level. But what can I say to them that will help us understand that that's something we need to be doing?
It's, you know, one of the things that annoyed us no end when we were struggling in South Africa was to have people arrive from overseas and come and tell us how we must solve our problems. Nothing annoyed us more. But having said that, having said that, I've given you an example of what people can do, and especially what young people can do, because I've got to say to all of you here that some of the people I have most admiration for are young people, because they are incredible in their idealism. I've just come away from 4 months on a ship with about 700 college students on something called Semester at Sea. They are fantastic. I mean, you are fantastic. I said, I mean, that it was largely you, not exclusively, but it was people like you in the 80s who were quite determined, and they did their thing. It is that too frequently people suffer from an imagined impotence. But after all, you have said this is government of the people, by the people, for goodness sake, make it that. And let the people enter into their legacy. And they can do it in a way quite quietly. And they don't have to be vociferous. But they can make it quite clear that there are some things that are unacceptable. You know, and sometimes people will ignore you for a while, but drip, 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 drip.
Archbishop Tutu, thank you very much for your wise words and your optimism, and reminding me that in this time of cynicism and frustration that there's a lot to be hopeful for, that what our country has done and can continue to do. And I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more on your thoughts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what the United States can and should do as they did in the apartheid regime. Thank you.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. That is all we're saying. I mean, that there is right and there is wrong. There is injustice, and you know, it's not a crazy Desmond Tutu who says this. There are several groups within Israel who are saying, for goodness sake, this is not what we believed this country was set up for. And it's so, I mean, and I want to salute them, because they're constantly being condemned as self-hating Jews. And I know, I mean, it's one of these incredible things. In South Africa, some of the most fervent anti-apartheid stalwarts. What? I mean, you almost expected it to be that something, it happens automatically, a Jew. Because I think they do have this memory. They do have this memory, and some of the people who treated us, I mean, about the only white people who treated us as if we were what we were, human beings, would have been the Joe Slovos, who happened to be communist. But they made you realize, I mean, no. Skin color is a total irrelevance, you know. Helen Suzman. Helen Suzman was virtually the only opposition in the apartheid parliament. She just turned 90, incredible woman. And yeah, I mean, you say almost everywhere you would be those people who automatically oppose injustice and oppression. And it hurts. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, to go there and be in the occupied territories and see things that you didn't believe possible. And when you mention it, you are then shut up by being accused of being anti-Semitic. I just hope, I mean, that is why in that Sabile address, I said, my appeal is listen to your scriptures. Listen to the God who has called you to be a special people.
Archbishop Tutu, thank you so much for coming today. I was wondering if you could reflect for us a little bit upon the legacy that you see for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and also in the rest of the world, now that there have been, I guess, several years since it finished its work.
Thank you very much. One of the first things is to realize that we don't have, as it were, a patent on TRCs. We are new kids on the block. Chile had one, Argentina, and so forth. And we learned from their achievements and their mistakes. I think one of the things that you get to learn is, one, that human beings have an incredible capacity for evil. Because when you sit there, you're listening to testimony, the people who testify about, we gave him drugged coffee, we shot him in the head, and then we burnt his body. And whilst his body was burning here, we were having a barbecue and drinking beer. And you say, what could have happened to the humanity of people that they could do that? But those people who did that kind of thing didn't have horns, you know. They didn't have tails that they were sitting on uncomfortably. They were people just like you and me. And we constantly were having to say, yeah, there, but for the grace of God, go I. That we have that capacity. But exhilaratingly, incredible, man, is the knowledge that we have. They say remarkable capacity for good, all of us. When you sat there and somebody related their story and you heard what they'd suffered, and then you expected them to be consumed by anger and bitterness. They just bowled you over. I mean, you said, this really makes you feel good about being human. That each one of us has an incredible capacity for good. In fact, we are made for goodness. And that goodness is the norm. All of the opposites are aberrations. And so you can go away from here. Even when you see Darfur, you see the Middle East, you see Burma, and you shake your head and you say, how could we ever be so cruel? Remember that even in those situations, there are incredible examples of human goodness. We've just come from Darfur. And one of the things that almost shakes you is looking at people who have lived under the most abominable conditions. And hey, and they have a dignity. You know, they can laugh. And the men, most of whom are Muslim, would be in spotless white costumes. And you look around the camp and you say, how could anybody manage to do this? They didn't see themselves as passive objects of pity. But the other is we haven't saluted them sufficiently. The humanitarian workers are incredible. And many of them are young, not all, but most of them are young. And it's people who you ask, how long have you been here? 3, 4 years. Doing what? Working in these conditions. That, I mean, your heart leaps with a joy, an exhilaration that here are human beings. You know, I mean, these guys and gaiesses could go anywhere and have a good job. But here they come and they work in these abominable conditions. Don't you feel good? Right?
Reverend Tutu, it's such an honor to be in your presence. My question is on South African illegals. This is a hot topic right now. My question is on South African illegal immigrants. Right now, it's a hot topic in America. But in South Africa, particularly in Johannesburg, illegal immigrants are being treated so badly. They cannot walk even freely in the streets without having the policemen picking them, putting them in yellow trucks, getting them to prison on the train, very bad conditions. My question is the South African government trying to help, or should we have to wait for another Gracia Marcel to come and influence like President Mandela did? He opened up a way to give illegal immigrants a legal system to help them stay in South Africa. Want to know what you're doing on that with your influence.
I've got to say quite clearly to you, I am devastated. I am devastated by the level of xenophobia that has reared its head in South Africa. Even when there is justification, I mean justification that there's already a great deal of poverty, there's unemployment and so on. I think, I mean, that we're a disgrace because we have forgotten so soon that almost all of these, the countries from which the people come, are countries that put themselves on the line for us. I mean, the so-called frontline states, because they opposed apartheid, gave basis to our liberation movements and had to run the gauntlet of the South African Defense Force. And I mean, some of us have said this, that, I mean, we, just on every kind of score, but on this particular one, it's a disgrace that we should be so ungrateful so soon. Having said that, I mean, I think we've got to try to see how you can maybe try to sort this problem. Part of the problem, of course, is that our Home Affairs Department has not exactly been covering itself in glory with its efficiency. It's been held up as one of the most inefficient government departments, so that even South Africans were trying to get IDs, passports, and so on. You have to wait an unconscionable time. But if we do get to a point where, and they are trying to work on this, we get to a point where we do have a department that can act efficiently, we ought to be trying to process people as quickly as you can, but recognizing that, in a sense, at the moment, you have a ceiling. I mean, you can't absorb everybody. So what we ought to be doing is, I said some time ago, apartheid devastated Southern Africa so horrendously, not just South Africa, but Southern Africa, that we could make a case for a special kind of Marshall Plan. That Europe would not be where it is today without having had the help of the Marshall Plan. And we are going to face a huge problem, because take this, the South African government, they are having to deal with the legacy of apartheid. And they are also having to deal with the present day contemporary needs of a developing country. And we don't have inexhaustible resources. And so a case could in fact be made for saying that if we want stability around there, then one of the ways is to make it comfortable, attractive for people not to want to leave their own countries. Because, everybody imagines that the streets of Johannesburg are paved with gold. But that's a universal phenomenon. People have forever gone into cities thinking that is where they are going to find salvation. Our own people do that. When you go to Cape Town, at the airport, as you come in, you see all of those shacks mushrooming around most of our cities, because people have left the rural areas imagining that life would be better in the urban areas. So the long term is trying to develop their home countries as much as possible. But I hope you will accept, on behalf of our people, my apology for the way we have treated our sisters and brothers from other parts of Africa.
Dear Archbishop Tutu, thank you so much also for your inspirational speech today. I actually wanted to ask you a question focused on the title of your speech today, Goodness Will Ultimately Prevail, which I think is a powerful antidote to the slogan, Power will ultimately prevail. And I was wondering what the source of your belief, of your fundamental belief is that goodness will ultimately prevail, and whether you believe it's just morally it will ultimately prevail, or also in real political terms. And if also in real political terms, what timeline you see, what you think is ultimate?
I'm looking at my crystal ball. No. There is no question about the triumph of goodness. And I mean, it would be almost a contradiction in terms to say goodness and then mean power. Have you noticed? Who are the people we most admire around the world? It's been an incredible thing, because you would have thought that in a culture that is so hard-nosed, almost cynical, that the people we would admire would be the macho, the aggressive, the successful. And now you look and you see Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa. Now, there are many things you could say about her. Macho is not one of them. And even in terms of success, she didn't succeed. I mean, if you're saying, I mean, she wanted to do all she could to help the derelicts and those, the poor people. And in many ways you could say, yeah, well, I mean, it was such a huge task. And yet the world holds her as an incredible icon. Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, here is this guy who dresses funny and doesn't have a single gun to his name and defeats the British Raj. And the world says, yeah, this is someone we revere. The Dalai Lama. I mean, he can't even speak English properly. I mean, he's an incredible man. I mean, so full of fun that you would forget that he's been in exile for 50 years. In exile for 50 years. I mean, he's as mischievous as a small boy. I mean, often I'm sitting next to him and I say, shh, shh. The cameras are on us. Try to behave like a holy man. But I mean, when the Dalai Lama says, or they say he's going to New York, he's about the only non-pop star who can fill Central Park. And why? I mean, he's patently not been successful. Otherwise, he'll be back home in Tibet. And Nelson Mandela. It is that they are good. They are good, and we each have a kind of antenna, pair of antennae which home in on this goodness. That I mean, your heart leaps. Because in fact, that is what we are made for. You know, a great African saint put it this way, speaking about how we are a paradox. You know, we are finite creatures made for the infinite. And so St. Augustine of Hippo could say, speaking about God, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That each one of us, incredibly, has, as somebody has said, a God-shaped space in us, and only God can fill that space. And we hunger for transcendence. We hunger for goodness, because that is what we're made for, you know. And it is a goodness that says, I want the best for you, because that is how I will get the best for me. In our language, we speak of something called Ubuntu. Ubuntu. the essence of being human. Ubuntu says a person is a person through other persons. I need you to be all you can be so that I can be all I can be. Our humanity is bound up with one another's. Timeline. Give me notice of the question. No, timeline. You know, there was a time when people said, that South African situation, totally intractable. There's no way in which it's going to be resolved except through a bloodbath. Eh? Here we are. No bloodbath. Northern Ireland, for a very long time. I used to go there and I say, just tell me, please just tell me. How are you able to tell that, that one is a Roman Catholic. That one is a, I say, at least we had, we had the benefit of, you know what. Yeah. But we were involved with Donna Hicks in an incredible program that the BBC ran, Facing the Truth, where we were a panel of 3, and you had victims and perpetrators from both sides of that conflict. Human beings are incredible. Human beings are incredible, man. Yeah, I mean, there is a great deal of evil in the world, but hey, there is a great deal of good. Human beings are incredible. I mean, I can very well imagine that there would be times when God looks at some of the things that we do, and God says, gee, whatever got into me to create that lot? But there are also many, many times when God looks down and says, ah! Now that's why I created them. That's why I created them. Thank you. I've stressed that answer so you don't ask another question, Nancy, right?